The next morning, Jack White was already awake. Several documents lay spread out across the table in front of him as he quietly reviewed reports and notes. A knock came at the door. "Come in," Jack said. Henrik entered. Jack glanced up. "I need you to handle a few things for me." Henrik nodded. "Of course. Like I mentioned yesterday, I want you to handle the men the prince sent. He'll probably have them waiting somewhere at his estate or another location." Henrik nodded. "I can take care of that." Jack leaned back slightly in his chair, placing both elbows on the table and resting his chin against his hands. "There is something else." Henrik raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Jack was silent for a moment. "Do you know of any good alchemists?" Henrik looked at him curiously. "Why?" Jack glanced toward the window. "It concerns Lydia. I want to see if I can arrange some sort of mechanical arm for her." Henrik was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "It can be done, but those procedures aren't exactly pleasant. You'll also need to take a few things into consideration." Jack looked at him. "Such as?" "Infection. The body doesn't always react well. You'll need someone nearby afterwards, a doctor, or at least someone knowledgeable enough to monitor the recovery." Jack nodded. "Well, money can buy a temporary doctor." Henrik gave a faint smile. "That it can." He thought for a moment. "There is an alchemist here in Valemareth. He occasionally works with sailors and laborers who lose limbs in accidents. I've heard his work is quite good. He also works alongside a dwarf craftsman." Jack immediately looked interested. "Where is he?" Henrik gave him the directions. Jack committed them to memory. "Good. I'll take Lydia there myself."
Not long afterwards, the group split up. Henrik departed to handle the matters involving the prince's men. Jack prepared to take Lydia to visit the alchemist. Far away, across the border in the Kadrisar Empire, another set of plans was already being put into motion. Thomas Harlow stood in a quiet alleyway between rows of old brick buildings in Brascan. The sounds of the busy city echoed faintly from the nearby streets. A man wearing a police uniform approached him before stopping a short distance away. He gave a subtle nod. Thomas looked toward him. "So, did you gather the information I requested?" The officer nodded. "Yes, sir. I found exactly what you wanted." Thomas folded his hands behind his back. "Good. I take it you figured out who's paying whom?" "Yes. A number of police officers are being paid by several crime families, just as you suspected." Thomas nodded. "And there is more." The officer shifted slightly. "The police maintain files on the crime families, names, contacts, operations, but most of the time those files mysteriously disappear." Thomas gave a faint smile. "Convenient." "Very." The officer continued. "The crime families also maintain contacts in neighboring countries. Many of those connections eventually lead back to slave trading organizations." Thomas's expression darkened slightly. "Explain." He said, "When Kadrisar experiences shortages, the crime families help locate vulnerable targets, children, runaways, poor villages. They gather information and pass it along." He paused briefly. "To be honest, some of the crime families are directly involved in the slave trade. They don't merely supply information, some of them sell slaves themselves, and many of them have connections that reach into neighboring countries. They've formed partnerships with several foreign slave trading organizations. They profit from the trade itself." Thomas's expression remained calm, though his eyes narrowed slightly. "I see." Thomas remained silent for several moments. Then he asked another question. "Have you been able to gather that other information, the underground guilds here?" The officer hesitated. "Well, not exactly. It seems that even the police are, to a certain extent, afraid of them, Or perhaps they're being paid by them. My investigation hasn't uncovered that information yet." He paused for a moment before continuing. "There are a few possibilities. The underground guilds may have planted their own informants inside the police, or someone else is paying officers to make documents disappear. There is also another possibility. The police themselves may be involved in certain criminal activities." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Well, that is interesting. So, someone else is also playing our game." The officer nodded. "It would appear so." Thomas remained silent for a moment. "Well, continue with your investigation, but also see what you can find out about the possibility that someone else is playing the same game we are. But don't become reckless. Play it safe. I'll see what I can uncover myself." He paused. I see. Continue with your mission. Don't concern yourself with anything else. I'll make sure we eventually discover who's behind it." The officer nodded. "There is also another question. Do you think the police merely tolerate the crime families, or do you think they have some sort of arrangement with them?" Thomas looked at him but said nothing. The officer continued, "Nothing is impossible. With a little more time, I should be able to gather enough information to point us in the right direction. And regarding the possibility that someone else has an agent inside the police, I'll investigate that as well. If someone else is playing the same game we are, I'll eventually find signs of it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Good. Continue with your work and keep me informed." He looked directly at the officer. "And remember, you're not alone in there." The officer gave a firm nod. "I understand." Without another word, he disappeared back into the crowded streets. Thomas remained standing alone in the alleyway. For several moments, he simply thought. Then a faint smile crossed his face. "Well, this certainly makes things interesting. As the boss always says, if one man is capable of playing a game like this, then another man is capable of playing it as well." He looked toward the busy streets of Brascan. "Now we simply need to discover who that man is." As Thomas Harlow stepped out of the alley, one of his men approached him at a brisk pace. Thomas glanced toward him. "Any word from Jeshny and Darien? Do we know whether they're heading back to Brascan?" The man shook his head. "Not yet, sir, but knowing those two, they've probably already completed their assignment." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Good. It seems we may need to make a few adjustments. I also need you to gather a few additional men. We have some new questions that need answering, and after the information we've just uncovered, I have a feeling the boss will want answers. I'd rather not disappoint him." The man nodded. "There is one person I'd recommend, Miguel. So far, every assignment you've given him has been carried out with flawless precision. He works like a well-oiled machine." Thomas gave a slight nod. "So I've heard." The two men continued walking through the streets. Before long, they arrived at another building. They stepped inside. The door closed quietly behind them. Miguel was already waiting. Thomas looked toward him. "Come with me." Miguel immediately stood and followed him into a smaller room. Once the door had closed, Thomas folded his hands behind his back. "I understand you're quite good at what you do." Miguel nodded. "Yes, sir. When it comes to firearms, I'm very confident in my abilities." Thomas studied him for a moment. "I'll need you to handle a few matters for me." He paused. "But first, I want to ask you something." Miguel remained silent. "What made you join us?" The young man answered without hesitation. "Let's just say I have a personal hatred for the slave trade, and I was searching for someone. Your organization found me before I found them." Thomas nodded slowly. "If you continue performing the way you have, I'll make sure you're introduced to someone who has access to far more information than I do." Miguel's expression softened slightly. Thomas continued. "The person you're looking for, were they sold?" Miguel simply nodded. "Yes." Thomas remained quiet for a moment.
I thought so much. So that's your true objective. Not money, not status, but finding someone. Miguel nodded once again. Yes, sir. Thomas looked at him calmly. We'll see what we can do. Write down the person's name and the last location where you know they were seen. You've been with us long enough. We'll put our ears to the ground. Miguel stepped forward and handed him a folded piece of paper. Everything I know is written there. Thomas accepted it and glanced over the page. Good. You may go. Miguel nodded respectfully before leaving the room. The door closed behind him. One of the senior operatives stepped closer. What was that about? Thomas continued looking at the paper. Something every good leader should remember. He folded the page and placed it inside his coat. Always find out what motivates someone, and then determine whether that motivation aligns with your own. If it doesn't, they can never truly become an ally. He looked toward the operative. I also want you to investigate this name. Verify every piece of information on this page. If everything checks out, then we may be able to help him. The operative nodded. I'll get started immediately. Thomas looked toward the window for a brief moment. Then he spoke quietly. Let's hope his search leads us to something much bigger.
Thomas Harlow turned away from the window and looked toward his operative. You said he's quite skilled with a gun. The man nodded. Well, not just a gun. Any weapon you place in his hands. It seems like, well, he's a master of it. You can hand him a knife. He knows how to throw it. You can hand him a sword. He knows how to fight with it. A stick. Anything. It almost seems as though he was born to use a weapon. Thomas remained silent for a moment. Then he nodded slightly. I see. The operative continued. To be honest, he never stayed long with any single guild. It was almost as if he was constantly moving from one place to another, taking assignments from different guilds. What I eventually picked up was that he seemed to be conducting some sort of investigation. Thomas looked at him. Go on. The man nodded. After I paid someone to gather a little information, I learned that he kept asking about a woman. I can't remember the name, but after I had a few others quietly follow him, they all reported the same thing. Everywhere he went, he asked about the same woman. He would give people her description, then move on to the next town if no one knew anything. Thomas lowered his gaze for a moment, then quietly said, Well, that certainly supports his story. His actions line up with what he told us. But in our line of work, we don't rely on assumptions. We rely on proof beyond reasonable doubt. He looked back toward the operative. What ultimately convinced him to join us? The man answered without hesitation. It wasn't the money. That hardly interested him. But when I mentioned that our organization has access to information, especially information involving the slave trade, that caught his attention immediately. Thomas folded his hands behind his back. Well, that also lines up. So, for now, it's reasonable to assume he's telling us the truth, at least until evidence proves otherwise. He paused. But something still bothers me. He looked back toward the window. A man his age, with that level of skill, it doesn't happen by accident. To become that proficient with firearms and every other weapon, someone had to train him. His expression remained thoughtful. So, I'll remain cautious. For now, have our network continue gathering information on him. If everything continues matching his story, then we'll allow him a little deeper into the organization. He looked back toward the operative. But until then, you already know your assignments. Continue with them. The man nodded. Yes, sir.
He turned and quietly left the room. Thomas remained standing by the window. After several moments, he opened one of the desk drawers and removed several documents. He slowly scanned through each page, then quietly spoke to himself. The day's almost over. There's still one detail I need to solve. How do we get Jack White introduced to that banker? He thought for another moment. The boss probably already has an angle, but having additional information never hurts. That should work.
On the other side of the border, back in Concordime, the sun was beginning to set over the sea as Jack White and Lydia returned to the inn where Henrik had been waiting for them. They made their way upstairs to the second floor. Henrik immediately noticed the heavy bandages wrapped around Lydia's left arm. The stump had been carefully dressed after the procedure. He looked first at Lydia, then at Jack. Jack knelt beside Lydia and handed her a small package. Well done. That was only the first step. If everything goes well tomorrow, they'll fit the mechanical arm they've begun making. If not, we won't leave without it. Lydia nodded quietly. Jack reached into another parcel and handed her a book. Can you read? She nodded again. Yes. Jack smiled faintly. Good. Here's a story. It has a happy ending. And if you struggle with any of the words, call one of us. We'll read it with you. We'll only be gone for a little while. Lydia held the book gently against her chest and nodded once more. As she settled into her chair, Jack stepped aside with Henrik. Henrik lowered his voice. So, how did it go? Jack let out a quiet breath. Painful. She handled it better than I expected. They completed the first part of the procedure. They also treated the area to help reduce the pain, but it still wasn't a pleasant experience. Henrik nodded sympathetically. And the arm? Jack glanced toward Lydia before answering. I think it'll be worth it. Once it's finished, she'll be able to use it almost like a normal arm. He paused. Of course, as she grows, it'll need to be replaced every few years until she's fully grown. Henrik nodded. That makes sense. Jack folded his arms and looked out the window toward the sea, where the setting sun painted the horizon in shades of orange and gold. It's a long road, but at least it's a beginning. He remained silent for a moment before turning back to Henrik. Well, are you going to introduce me to the men the prince organized, especially this Goran you've mentioned? Henrik nodded. Of course, but technically he's the only one who's already here. The others haven't arrived yet. Perhaps we should invite him upstairs. Jack nodded. Good. We still need to order something to eat tonight. He might as well order with us. Henrik smiled faintly. I take it Lydia won't be joining us for dinner. Jack glanced toward Lydia as she quietly made her way to her room. No, she'll be eating in her room. The two men headed downstairs. Before reaching the front desk, Henrik led Jack into the lounge. A single man stood waiting there. Jack, Henrik said, this is Goran. Jack immediately understood what Henrik had meant earlier. The man towered over everyone in the room. He stood more than a head taller than both Jack and Henrik. Grey had already begun creeping in his beard and hair. His broad shoulders and massive frame made him look like he had been carved from solid stone. Yet despite his size, there was nothing clumsy about the way he carried himself. Goran stepped forward. The two men shook hands. His grip was firm. Jack studied him for a brief moment. Well, will you join us upstairs for dinner? We can discuss business privately. Goran nodded. Yes, of course. The three men stopped by the counter and each placed their dinner order. A few moments later, they made their way back upstairs.
After entering the room, Jack gestured toward the table. "Make yourself comfortable. There's just one or two things I need to take care of. I'll join you shortly." Goran nodded and took a seat. Jack quietly walked over to Lydia's room. He gently reminded her to remain inside unless she needed anything. She nodded in understanding. Jack then returned and took his seat at the table opposite Goran. For a brief moment, neither man spoke. Then Goran broke the silence. "Well, if I understand the job correctly, you want me to help free a number of slaves from the Kadrasar Empire and assist with a few other operations." Jack nodded calmly. "All of those details will be given to you in due time, but let's just say you'll be playing a crucial role in preventing something that could have very serious consequences for Conquerdine." He studied Goran for a moment. "I take it you're in. Otherwise, you wouldn't have come here." Goran gave a single firm nod. "Yes." Jack allowed himself a faint smile. "Good. As for now, enjoy dinner tonight. The rest will be discussed later." He paused briefly. "But understand this. This operation carries considerable risk, especially since we'll likely be crossing paths with several crime families." Goran's expression never changed. "I understand." A few moments later, there was a knock at the door. The inn staff entered carrying the meals they had ordered and carefully placed them on the table. The smell of freshly prepared food quickly filled the room. For a short while, the conversation shifted away from conspiracies, politics, and war. Tomorrow would bring enough challenges of its own.